There are places where the sea seems to remember things that people have forgotten. On the northern edge of a lonely coastline stood an old lighthouse called Blackwater Beacon. It had watched over the ocean for more than 200 years, surviving violent storms, shipwrecks, and generations of lighthouse keepers. But the villagers who lived nearby had one warning for anyone who came to the lighthouse after sunset. Never watch the sea when the fog comes in, because sometimes a ship returned. The strange part was that the ship had been lost more than a century ago. Blackwater Beacon stood on a cliff surrounded by sharp rocks and endless dark water. During the day, it looked almost ordinary. Its white tower rose above the cliffs, and its enormous lantern room flashed across the ocean every few seconds. But at night, especially when thick fog covered the water, the lighthouse seemed to become something else. For generations, local fishermen had told the same story. A ghost ship appeared offshore. It never came close enough to reach. It never attacked. It simply appeared from the fog, sailed silently toward the lighthouse, circled the rocky waters below the cliff, and disappeared before sunrise. The ship was always described the same way: an old wooden vessel with 3 tall masts, torn black sails, and a single lantern glowing near the bow. No one knew its name. No one knew why it returned. And no one could explain why every lighthouse keeper eventually saw it. In 2026, a young historian named Daniel Reed arrived at Blackwater Beacon to investigate the legend. Daniel had spent years researching forgotten buildings and unexplained historical events, and he believed most ghost stories had ordinary explanations. He had heard about Blackwater Beacon while studying an old maritime archive. One sentence in a damaged journal had caught his attention: "The ship returns whenever the light calls it home." Daniel couldn't stop thinking about those words. When he arrived at the lighthouse, he met its final caretaker, an elderly man named Elias Ward. Elias had lived beside the lighthouse for nearly 50 years. Daniel asked him about the ghost ship. Elias didn't smile. Instead, he looked toward the sea. "You shouldn't ask about that ship after dark." Daniel laughed nervously. "I'm a historian. I'm here because I want answers." Elias slowly turned toward him. Answers are not always meant to be found. That night, Daniel stayed in the lighthouse. At 11:47 p.m., the weather changed. A thick fog rolled over the sea. The wind stopped. Even the waves seemed strangely quiet. Daniel stood beside the lantern room, looking through the glass. Then he saw it. Far beyond the rocks, a faint yellow light appeared in the darkness. Then the light moved closer. Slowly, a dark shape emerged from the fog. 3 masts, old wooden sails, a long black hull, and a single lantern burning at the front. Daniel's heart began pounding. The ship was real. It sailed without making a sound. No engine, no creaking wood, no crashing waves, nothing. It moved directly toward Blackwater Beacon. Daniel grabbed his camera and ran downstairs. "Elias." The old caretaker was already awake. He stood at the window, staring at the sea. "You saw it," Daniel whispered. Elias nodded. "Yes." "What is that ship?" Elias didn't answer. Daniel pointed toward the water. "It's coming straight toward us." "I know." The ghost ship passed beneath the lighthouse. For one brief moment, the fog opened. Daniel saw something painted across the ship's stern. A name. He raised his camera. But before he could read it, the fog closed again. The ship vanished. Daniel immediately checked his photograph. The image was almost completely black. But one thing remained visible. 3 letters. MER. The next morning, Daniel searched the maritime archives. After hours of research, he found an old record belonging to a merchant vessel called the Mercy Belle. The ship had disappeared 137 years earlier. According to the records, the Mercy Belle had been carrying supplies along the coast during a violent winter storm. The vessel never reached its destination. 32 people were aboard. None were ever found. But there was something even stranger. The final entry in the ship's captain's journal had been written only hours before the disappearance. Daniel read it carefully. "The lighthouse has appeared through the storm. We are turning toward its light." Daniel froze. Blackwater Beacon had been their destination. But the lighthouse record said something different. According to official documents, the lighthouse had gone dark that night because its keeper had abandoned the tower during the storm. If that was true, then how had the crew seen the light? Daniel continued reading. The final sentence was written in shaky handwriting. If we do not return, the light must never be extinguished. Daniel took the document to Elias. The old man stared at the page for a long time. Then he finally spoke. There is more. He led Daniel to a locked room beneath the lighthouse. Inside were old maps, broken lantern parts, photographs, and hundreds of handwritten reports. Daniel opened one. Another. Every report described the same ship, the Mercy Belle. But the strangest reports were written by lighthouse keepers who had never seen the old records. They all described the ship before learning its name. Daniel looked at Elias. Why didn't anyone tell the authorities? They did. And no one believed them. Elias walked toward an old wooden cabinet. He opened a drawer and removed a brass key. This lighthouse has a secret. Daniel followed him down a narrow staircase hidden behind the storage shelves. The stairs led deep beneath the cliff. At the bottom was a stone chamber. In the center stood an ancient mechanism connected to the lighthouse. Daniel stared at it. What is this? Elias answered quietly. The original light system. But the lighthouse was rebuilt. Above the ground, yes. Elias pointed toward a wall. There was an inscription carved into the stone. When the light calls, the lost will return. Daniel suddenly understood. The lighthouse had not simply guided ships. It had been built over something much older. According to Elias, the first lighthouse keeper had discovered the chamber more than 2 centuries ago. Inside was an ancient bronze lantern recovered from a shipwreck. The lantern had been placed in the lighthouse as a symbol of safe return. But after the Mercy Belle disappeared, something changed. Every few years, when heavy fog covered the sea, the ghost ship returned. And every time it appeared, the lighthouse light behaved strangely. Daniel wanted to dismiss the supernatural explanation. Then the lantern above them flickered. Once, twice, and went completely dark. The entire lighthouse fell silent. Elias looked terrified. It's never done that before. Daniel checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The same time as the previous night. Then they heard something from outside. A bell. One deep sound. Then another. Daniel ran to the window. The sea was covered in fog. And through the fog came the ghost ship. But this time it was closer. Much closer. Its lantern burned brighter than before. Daniel noticed something he had missed the previous night. There were figures standing on the deck. Dozens of them. They weren't moving. They simply stood there, facing the lighthouse. Then one figure raised an arm. Daniel stepped backward. Who are they? Elias whispered, the crew. Suddenly, the lighthouse light came back on. The beam crossed the ocean. The ghost ship stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the ship slowly turned away. Daniel watched as it disappeared into the fog. But this time, something remained behind. A small wooden object had washed onto the rocks beneath the lighthouse. The next morning, Daniel climbed down to retrieve it. It was a ship's compass. On its back were engraved words. We followed the light. Daniel returned to the archive and searched deeper. Eventually, he discovered the truth. The Mercy Belle had not simply disappeared. Its captain had been carrying a sealed metal box containing the lighthouse's original lantern mechanism. The object was being transported because officials planned to replace the old system. During the storm, the captain had seen Blackwater Beacon. He turned toward it, but the lighthouse was dark. The ship crashed somewhere beyond the reef. The crew disappeared. The lantern mechanism was never recovered. Daniel realized the ghost ship wasn't returning because it wanted revenge. It was returning because it was still searching for the light that had failed it. For 137 years, the crew had followed the same signal. The lighthouse. The light. The promise of home. Daniel and Elias decided to restore the ancient lantern. They worked through the night. At midnight, the fog returned. The ghost ship appeared again. But this time, the lighthouse beam changed. A warm golden light spread across the ocean. The ghost ship stopped. For the first time, Its lantern went dark. Then the vessel began moving away from the lighthouse. Slowly, peacefully. As it sailed toward the horizon, the fog around it began to disappear. One by one, the figures on its deck vanished. Daniel watched silently. Then the final figure turned toward the lighthouse. Daniel couldn't explain how he knew. But somehow, he felt the figure was saying goodbye. The ship disappeared beyond the horizon. And it never returned. At sunrise, Daniel searched the rocks below the cliff. He found one final object. A small brass plate from the original lantern. Engraved on it were 4 words: "Light them home." Years later, Blackwater Beacon became a protected historical site. Daniel published his investigation, but many people still refused to believe the story. Some said the ship had been a trick of the fog. Others believed it was an optical illusion. And some believed the lighthouse had truly released the lost crew. But Elias never argued with anyone. Before he died, he gave Daniel one final warning: never let the light go out. Daniel promised. Today, Blackwater Beacon still shines over the Northern Sea. Visitors come during the day to photograph the old tower. They walk along the cliffs. They read about the Mercy Bell. Most leave before sunset, because the locals still remember the old warning. When the fog comes in, stay away from the windows. Don't search the sea. And if you ever see a distant lantern moving through the mist, don't follow it. Because according to the oldest stories, the ghost ship may have finally found its way home. But the sea remembers every light that fails. And sometimes, it returns to remind us. If you enjoyed this mystery, make sure to subscribe to Whispering Walls for more forgotten places, haunted buildings, lost ships, and unexplained stories from history. Turn on notifications, because somewhere in the world, another old building is still hiding a secret, and perhaps the next one is waiting for us to find it.